Well, actually, I want to thank everybody on the panel for today's presentation. Very excellent. Just thank Dr. Thompson for your work. And I'd like to actually have two questions. First, with the process, have you, I wasn't sure if I caught if you had done this or not, have you analyzed the movement of people from different cultures across the United States? That's my first question. And if you have, what has been your observations about that process? And the second question is, have you considered using your process with, along with natural language processing, I believe so. NLP, measuring disturbances as far as using the Twitter sentiment data and tracking social disturbances in different areas.
Were you asking Andrew?
I was asking you, Dr. Thompson.
Because no, I haven't. I haven't studied the migration of or the movement of specific groups of people. You know, I interact some with people that have been doing that type of research, but I haven't worked specifically on that. I mean, some of this work is motivated by things like undocumented workers in different countries and all these elusive populations. And there was another part.
The other question is, have you considered using natural language processing, using Twitter sentiment data as far as tracking civil disturbances?
No, I haven't worked in that.
I just have one actually comments on that. I think one area here is to see how these methods, which have been typically applied to Indian populations so far, how the ideas would apply more broadly to surveys, say demographic surveys. And I think one of the key things here is to have a data collection method which doesn't require intervention or respondents. So I have in mind such social networks as Twitter or Facebook as some component like that. Now the use of these has a lot of challenges to it, but to give an example where it might be useful is because of the extensive range which Facebook covers. If you wanted to get migration information, you could in principle get it close to real time by tracking people as they move locations based on Facebook. Now there are a lot of issues with this approach, including the coverage of Facebook ethics and privacy. But in principle, you can see without having interviewing anybody just using Facebook posts, you could gain an enormous amount of information about very important demographic processes. And I think moving from where we are now to a world in which we can do that in an ethical and efficient manner is a large challenge, but something we should definitely attempt.
Are there any other questions? I guess maybe I should ask this question. Okay. So, in epidemiology and public health, there's been some interest, maybe a few years ago, with strong interest in how people with certain adverse health conditions are kind of related to other people that are linked to other people that have adverse health conditions. I know people like there was a paper in the New England Medicine about obesity. Obese people seem to be their friends tend to be obese, and there was some trying to remember exactly what the conclusions were, but that this was there was indication that having a friend that was obese made you higher risk for being obese. I was wondering if any of you have thought about those sorts of problems.
Correlation is not the same as causation. This particular study, they claim to have causal evidence, not merely that obese people were more likely to know other obese people, but in addition to that, if you became obese and your friends were then likely to become obese, and because friendship is somewhat of a one-way phenomenon that I consider Mark a friend, but he doesn't actually like me very much, for example. So it actually used a one-way aspect of this to demonstrate that it was going one way, not the other, which was taken for evidence for contagion. Now, unfortunately, when other people reanalyzed the data and found that height was also contagious. And so there was a suggestion that there are some artifacts in your methods, or as Mark might say, your standard errors were too low because they weren't really accounting for clustering. And so I admire that they looked at that, but I would not actually believe that.
So when, like when HIV, that is when AIDS, so the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, first came to attention with some, I think in the early 1980s or something, but there was a syndrome, but nobody knew what it was or something, but people started to infer that it looked like it was contagious because of the pattern that people were close to each other, where it was spread. But I mean, that was some time before we identified the virus.
I think there's some other questions. Nat Shankar, and thank you very much for great talks and discussions. So these kinds of methods, clearly one needs to make some assumptions along the way, or use models to do inference. And I was wondering, have there been any diagnostics developed for checking the assumptions or the models that we need to use? And or is there potential for doing that? Yeah, that's any one of the three. So.
I'll start with that. First, I'll say that's a very major issue here, because again, the social networks, the underlying phenomena is very complex, and the models try to track that complexity very easily mismatched. There's been some attempts to do this process, and one is based on a simulation idea, which is if you fit a net network model, you then simulate from the network model and take some complex structural feature of the data and compare it to that same feature on the simulated networks. Now, presumably that feature is not one of the ones used in fitting the model. It would be some idiosyncratic feature, and the idea would be such as geodesic distances within the actual network structure. And you can't prove that it fits clearly, but at least it gives you some sense of when it doesn't fit and how badly it doesn't fit. There's been some work on this and related ideas, and in particular there's a paper in JASA in 2008 by Dave Hunter, Steve Weaver, and myself, which looks at the technical aspects of this approach.
It sounds as if it might relate to posterior predictive jazz.
Well, two things. Actually, I would love to say that we did posterior predictive checks, but we don't really, partly because I think the hardest part of the model is not the model of the data, but the model connecting the data to the underlying reality, which is harder to check. I think the two things that we found the most useful have been first gathering data just in different ways, like asking the survey question different ways at different times, and we'll do one survey and we estimate social network size to be on average 700, and do another survey and average social network size of 100, because you just change sort of the order of how you ask the question. The other thing that's been useful are what they call in economics placebo control studies, where you look at how a certain variable predicts something that shouldn't matter. For example, the contagion of height. I think those tools have been extremely useful in check.
Are there any other questions?
Could each one of you please comment on the software you have used? Software. Statistical analysis of the software.
My current software, like that was shown in the video clips, that's all from scratch.
I understand that. I'm talking about getting your results. For example, one person's talking about voting, so are you using R or SAS or STATA, and
I used R for my net. I used R for some years for my network, for the network stuff. But when it came to the networks, and the dynamic network and the temporal, spatial kind of full and interacting designs and stuff, that's all in C because it's so much faster.
And is that available to everyone?
No, it will be soon with the paper, but it'll be, I'm going to say, it's going to be like research level, like use as you wish, not. So it's been in development.
So the work I do, most of it's based on the StatNet software, which is software developed for fitting and analysis of social network information. So this is basically a suite of R packages which interface C when necessary. And there's a group, the StatNet group, that develops this software. Also, for the adaptive sampling work, there's a hidden population methods research group, which I'm a member of, and that has software as well. It's on CRAN and on the website. I think having open software to do this work is I think really important, mainly because you can see exactly what the models are doing. We write our papers and they sound great because the narrative in the paper is very clear, but the software never lies, as I'm fond of saying, and you can see what people are actually doing. So I think this is an important part of open science and reproducible science.
We actually have some code that lies, and it's really great. People said they couldn't do it, that code never lies, but we were able to actually. It was great. We use R to make our graphs, and we fit our models in STAN.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. My employer deals with forms coming in from the public. We have two goals with these forms. One is to capture all members of the public with a particular characteristic in order to stage an intervention. That sounds like adaptive network sampling could help us because there are some potential fields we could use as network predictors in these forms. But we also have the goal of accurately estimating the incidence of this feature of the population. To have any advice for how to accomplish both in an adaptive network sampling setting. Anybody who feels you can answer that as welcome to, please.
I think you should be able to do it using post-stratification, but I think it would take some work and you need to set your assumptions down. But I feel that if you feel that your sample is not representative of the population, then I think that you should be able to identify the aspects of which you think is different and to measure those aspects as best you can. Then there's also correlation with your sample, and you might want to do something like a bootstrap in order to get standard errors. That's yet another issue.
I want to thank the speaker and our two discussants, and I guess so at this point we'll close out the program. I want to thank the speaker and discussants for excellent presentations, lively discussions. There's one more bit of business to do, which is to present a certificate, which is an innovation that we on the Hansen Committee have just started as of last year. Certificate to the main speaker. Make this into a photo op. Thank you all. It's time now to follow the NAF indicated people who will take us across this tunnel to the Wicking Pavilion. Please join us for the reception that follows.